Hey guys, let's get into chapter 4. What do you say? This is The Giver, chapter 4 by Lois Flowers. Jonas rode at a leisurely pace, glancing at the bike ports beside the buildings to see if he could spot Asher's. He didn't often do volunteer hours with his friend because Asher frequently fooled around and made serious work a little bit difficult. But now, with 12 coming so soon and the volunteer hours ending, it didn't seem to matter. The freedom to choose where to spend those hours had always seemed wonderful luxury to Jonas. Other hours of the days were carefully regulated. He remembered when he had become 8, as Lily would do shortly, and he had faced the freedom of choice. The 8s always set out on their first volunteer hour a little nervously, giggling and staying in groups of friends. They almost inevitably did their hours on recreation duty first, helping with the younger ones in place where they still felt comfortable. But with guidance, as they developed self confidence and maturity, they moved on to other jobs, gravitating towards those that would suit their own interests and skills. A male, 11, named Benjamin, had done his entire nearly 4 years in the rehabilitation center, working with citizens who had been injured. It was rumored that he was as skilled now as the rehabilitation directors themselves, that he had even developed some machines and methods to hasten rehabilitation. There was no doubt Benjamin would receive his assignment to the field and would probably be permitted to bypass most of the trainings. Jonas was impressed by things Benjamin had achieved, and he knew him, of course, since they'd always been in group mates, but they never talked about the boy's accomplishments because such a conversation would have been awkward for Benjamin. There was never a comfortable way to mention or discuss one's success without breaking the rule against bragging, even if it didn't mean to. It was a minor rule, rather like rudeness, punishable only by gentle chastisement. But still, better to steer clear of occasion governed by a rule which is so easily to break. The area of dwellings behind him, Jonas rode past the community structures, hoping to spot Asher's bicycle parked beside one of the small factories or office buildings. He passed the childcare center where Lily stayed after school and the play area surrounding it. He rode through the central plaza and the large auditorium where public meetings were held. And Jonas slowed and looked into the name tags on the bicycles lined up outside the nurturing center. Then he checked those outside the food distribution. It was always fun to help with the deliveries, and he hoped that he could find his friend there so they could work together on the daily rounds, carrying cartons of supplies into dwellings of the community. But he finally found Asher's bicycle, leaning, as usual, instead of upright in its port, as it should have been, at the house of the old. There was only one other child's bicycle there, that of a female 11 named Fiona. Jonas liked Fiona. She was a good student, quiet and polite, but she had a sense of fun as well, and it didn't surprise him that she was working with Asher today. He parked his bicycle neatly in the port beside theirs and entered the building. Hello, Jonas, the attendant at the front desk said. She handed him a sign up sheet and stamped her own official seal next to his signature. All the volunteer hours would be carefully tabulated in the Hall of Open Records. Once, long ago, it was whispered among the children that an 11 had arrived at the ceremony of 12 only to hear a public announcement that he had not completed the required number of volunteer hours and would not, therefore, be given his assignment. He had only been permitted an additional month in which to complete the hours and then given the assignment privately with no applause, no celebration. A disgrace that would cloud his entire future. It's good to have some volunteers here today, the attendant told him. We celebrated a release this morning, and that always throws the schedule off a little, so things get backed up. She looked at the printed sheet. Let's see. Asher and Fiona are helping in the bathing room. Why don't you go join them there? You know where it is, don't you? Jonas nodded and thanked her. He walked down the long hallway and he glanced into the rooms on either side. The old were sitting there quietly, some visiting and talking to one another, others doing handwork and simple crafts. A few were asleep. Each room was comfortable, it was furnished, and the floors covered with thick carpeting. It was a serene and slow-paced place. Unlike the busy centers of manufacturers and distribution where daily work in the community occurred, Jonas was glad that he had over the years chosen to put his hours in a variety of places so he could experience the difference. He realized, though, that not focusing on one area meant he was left not with the slightest idea, not even a guess of what his assignment would be. He laughed softly. Thinking about the ceremony again, Jonas, he teased himself. But he suspected that with the date so near, probably all of his friends were too. He passed the caretaker walking slowly with one of the old in the hall. Hello, Jonas, the young uniformed man said, smiling pleasantly. The woman beside him, whose arm he held, was hunched over and shuffled along in her soft slippers. She looked towards Jonas and smiled, but her dark eyes were clouded and blank, and he realized that she was blind. He entered the bathing room with its warm, moist air and its scent of cleaning lotions. He removed his tunic, hung it carefully on the wall hook, and put the volunteer smock that was folded on the shelf. Hi, Jonas, Asher called in the corner and kneeling beside the tub. And Jonas saw Fiona nearby at a different tub. She looked up and smiled at him, but she was busy gently washing the man who lay in the warm water. Jonas greeted them and the caretaking attendants at work nearby, and then he went to the row of padded lounging chairs where the other old were waiting. He had worked here before, and he knew what to do. Your turn, Larissa, he said, reading the name tag on the woman's robes. I'll start the water, and then I'll help you up. He pressed the button on a nearby empty tub and watched the warm water flood through in many small openings on the sides. The tub would be filled in a minute, and the water would stop automatically. He helped the woman from the chair, led her to the tub, removed her robe, and steadied her with his hand on her arm as she stepped in and lowered herself. She leaned back and sighed with pleasure. Her head was on a soft cushioned headrest. Comfortable? He asked. She nodded. Her eyes closed, and Jonas squeezed cleansing lotion on a clean sponge at the edge of the tub and began to wash her frail body. Last night, he had watched as his father bathed the new child. This is much the same. The fragile skin, the soothing water, the gentle motion of the hand, slippery with soap, the relaxed, peaceful smile on the woman's face reminded him of Gabriel being bathed. And the nakedness, too. It was against the rules for children or adults to look at others' nakedness, but the rule did not apply to new children or the old. Jonas was glad. It was a nuisance to keep oneself covered while changing for games, and required an apology if one had a mistake glimpsed another's body while it was always awkward. He couldn't see why it was necessary, and he liked the feeling of safety here in the warm and quiet room. He liked the expression of trust on the woman's face as she lay in the water, unprotected, exposed, and free. From the corner of his eye, he could see his friend Fiona help the old man from the tub and tenderly pat his thin, naked body dry with an absorbent cloth. She helped him into his robe, and Jonas thought Larissa had drifted to sleep as the old often did, and he was careful to keep his motion steady and gentle, so as not to wake her. He was surprised when she spoke, her eyes still closed. This morning we celebrated the release of Roberto, she told him. It was wonderful. I knew Roberto, Jonas said. I helped his feeding the last time I was here, just a few weeks ago. He was a very interesting man. Larissa opened her eyes happily. They told his whole life before they released him, she said. They always do. But to be honest, she whispered with a mischievous look, some of the tellings are just a little bit boring, and I've even seen some of the old fall asleep during the tellings. When they released Edna recently, did you know Edna? Jonas shook his head. He couldn't recall anyone named Edna. Well, they tried to make her life sound meaningful. And of course, she added privately, all lives are meaningful. I don't mean that they aren't, but Edna, my goodness, she was a birth mother, and then she worked in a food production for years until she came here. She never even had a family unit. Larissa lifted her head and looked around to make sure no one else was listening, and then she confided, I don't think Edna was very smart. Jonas laughed. He rinsed her left arm, laid it in the back into the water, and began to wash her feet. She murmured with pleasure as he massaged her feet with a sponge. But Roberto's life was wonderful, Larissa went on after a moment. He had been an instructor of 11s. You know how important that is? And he'd been on planning committee, and goodness, I didn't know he found the time. He excuse me. He also raised two very successful children and also was the one of the landscaping design for the Central Plaza. He didn't do the actual labor, of course. Now you're back. Larissa, she leaned forward, and I'll help you sit up. Jonas put his arm around her and supported her as she sat. He squeezed the sponge on against her back and began to rub sharp boned shoulders. Tell me about the celebration. Well, there was the telling of his life, and that's always first, and then the toast, and we raised our glasses and cheered. We chanted the anthem. He made a lovely goodbye speech, and several of us made little speeches wishing him well. And I didn't, though. I've never been fond of public speaking. He was thrilled. You should have seen the look on his face when they let him go. Jonas slowed the strokes of his hand on her back through thoughtfully. Jonas slowed the strokes of his hand on her back thoughtfully. Larissa, he asked, what happens when they make the actual release? I mean, where exactly does Roberto go? She lifted her bare, wet shoulders in a small shrug. I don't know. I don't think anybody does, except for the committee. He just bowed to all of us and then he walked like they all do through the special door of the releasing room. But you should have seen his look. Pure happiness, I call it. Jonas grinned. I wish I'd been there to see it. Larissa frowned. I don't know why they don't let children come. Not enough room, I guess. They should enlarge the releasing room. We'll have to suggest that to the committee. Maybe they'll study it, Jonas said shyly. Larissa chortled with laughter. Right, she hooted, and Jonas helped her out of the tub. Sorry about that, guys. I couldn't find where my folder was that had my questions. Let me get to my questions. Okay, so we just read chapter 4. The 3 questions for chapter 4 are, number 1, what happens to the 8s? What happens to them whenever they go into their ceremony of the 8s? Number 2, where does Jonas spend his volunteer hours? What does he do? What did you learn? And number 3, what happens at the release? Later.